65,000 years. That's roughly how long people have been continuously living on the continent we now call Australia, making Aboriginal Australian culture the oldest continuous living culture on Earth, predating the pyramids by tens of thousands of years, predating agriculture itself. Now, put that next to this, the country most people associate with beaches, kangaroos, and laid back, no worries energy was for its first 100 plus years as a British colony, primarily a dumping ground for convicts. 65,000 years of continuity on one hand, a penal colony that's barely 2.5 centuries old on the other. Both of those are Australia, and neither one is the whole picture. Welcome back to Around the World in Half an Hour. I'm Ray, and today we're covering Australia, episode 9, and honestly, one of the biggest countries we've tackled so far, in every sense. It's the only nation on Earth that's also an entire continent. We'll cover the deep Aboriginal history that anchors this place, the British colonization that reshaped it violently, the path to a modern multicultural federation, and where things genuinely stand today on the unresolved question of reconciliation. Plus, deadly wildlife, world class coffee, a sport called Australian rules football that has to be seen to be believed, and why a country of 28 million people keeps winning an outsized share of Olympic medals. Let's get into it. Australia is enormous, about 7.69 million square kilometers, making it the sixth largest country on Earth by area, roughly the size of the contiguous United States, or about 32 times the size of the United Kingdom. And yet, it has a population smaller than Texas or New York State, which tells you almost everything about how this land actually gets used. Around 87% of Australians live in urban areas, and the overwhelming majority live within about 50 kilometers off the coastline. The interior, what Australians call the outback, is vast, dry, and largely empty. Red desert, scrubland, and ancient, worn down mountain ranges stretching across a landmass that's had roughly the same geological shape for hundreds of millions of years, making it, on average, the flattest and driest inhabited continent on the planet. Geographically, Australia breaks into few distinct zones. Along the east coast, the Great Dividing Range runs roughly 4,000 kilometers from Queensland down through New South Wales into Victoria. Not a dramatically tall range by world standards, but it's what separates the fertile, populated coastal strip from the dry interior. And it's why most Australian cities cluster on its ocean side. Move inland and you hit the vast, arid center, the Simpson Desert, the Great Victoria Desert, and the deep red sandstone country around Uluru, where daytime temperatures can swing more than 20 degrees Celsius between noon and midnight. Up north, the top end around Darwin and Kakadu runs tropical with a wet season and a dry season rather than four seasons, monsoonal rains, and some of the richest biodiversity and most significant Aboriginal rock art sites on the continent. And then there's the Great Barrier Reef, running over 2,300 kilometers along the Queensland coast, the largest living structure on Earth, visible from space, built by coral polyps over roughly 20,000 years, and currently facing serious, well documented stress from rising ocean temperatures and repeating bleaching events. Australia is also, notoriously, home to more venomous species than any other country on Earth. Box jellyfish, funnel web spiders, and 11 of the world's 15 most venomous snakes. In practice, deaths from these are rare because most Australians simply grow up knowing which rock pools to avoid and which spiders to leave alone. But the reputation is well earned, and Australians tend to find outsiders' fear of it all pretty funny. Australia is genuinely unusual here. It has zero land borders. It's an island continent, surrounded entirely by ocean, the Indian Ocean to the west, the Southern Ocean to the south, the Pacific to the east, and the Timor and Arafura seas to the north, separating it from Indonesia and Papua New Guinea by a relatively narrow stretch of water. That geographic isolation shaped almost everything about Australia's history. It meant the continent's Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples developed largely independently for tens of thousands of years. And it meant European powers didn't reach it until remarkably late in the age of exploration, relative to the Americas, Africa, or Asia. That isolation wasn't total though. Long before British colonization, Makassar fishermen from what's now Sulawesi in Indonesia were sailing to the northern coast for at least a couple of centuries, trading with Yolngu communities in Arnhem Land for trepang or sea cucumber, in a relationship well documented in Yolngu art, language, and oral history. Dutch navigators mapped sections of the western and southern coastline in the 1600s and called the continent New Holland, but didn't establish permanent settlements. It was Britain, following James Cook's 1770 voyage up the eastern coast, that claimed the continent for the crown and eventually built the colonies that would become modern Australia. Today, Australia's nearest neighbours, Indonesia, Papua New Guinea, New Zealand, and Timor Leste, matter enormously for trade, migration, and regional security, even though not one of them shares an actual land border. The story of this continent starts again around 65,000 years ago, when the ancestors of Aboriginal Australians arrived, almost certainly by sea, via what's now Indonesia, during a period of lower sea levels. Over tens of thousands of years, hundreds of distinct language groups and nations developed across the continent, each with its own territory, law, ceremony, and deep detailed knowledge of local land and water systems, all organized around a body of belief generally referred to in English as the dreaming or chukurpa in some Central Desert languages, a framework connecting creation, law, land, and ancestry that continues to shape Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander life today. By the time of British arrival, estimates of the pre colonial Aboriginal population range widely, generally somewhere between several hundred thousand and over a million people, organized into what were, by most linguistic counts, over 250 distinct language groups. British colonization began in 1788 when Captain Arthur Phillip landed the first fleet at Sydney Cove and established a penal colony built on the legal premise of terra nullius, Latin for nobody's land, a doctrine that treated the continent as legally unoccupied despite the existing population, and that formed the basis of dispossessing Aboriginal people of their land without treaty or formal compensation. A foundational difference from how colonization proceeded in, for example, New Zealand or Canada, where treaties were at least nominally negotiated. What followed over the next century included large scale killing during what's now generally referred to as the frontier wars, documented massacres, armed conflict, and violent land seizures as the colony expanded. alongside catastrophic population decline from introduced diseases like smallpox, to which Aboriginal populations had no prior immunity. Historians differ on exact figures, but the Aboriginal population is estimated to have declined by well over 90% within roughly a century of colonization. Australia's six British colonies federated into a single nation on January 1st, 1901, forming the Commonwealth of Australia. One of the few federal parliament's earliest pieces of legislation was the Immigration Restriction Act of 1901, the legal foundation of what became known as the White Australia policy, a set of laws explicitly designed to limit non European immigration, which remained largely in place in various forms until it was formally and fully dismantled through reforms completed by the mid 1970s. Meanwhile, from the early 1900s through the 1970s, government and church authorities in several states carried out policies of forcibly removing Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander children from their families, aiming, per the explicit policy language of the era, at assimilation. This is now known as the stolen generations. Estimates suggest roughly 1 in 3 Aboriginal children were removed during this period. A national inquiry documented the policy in a 1997 report titled Bringing Them Home, and in 2008, Prime Minister Kevin Rudd delivered a formal national apology to the stolen generations in Parliament. Australia's 20th century was also shaped by two world wars fought almost entirely on other continents. The 1950 Gallipoli campaign against Ottoman forces through a military defeat for Australian and New Zealand troops became a foundational national story. April 25th is still observed annually as Anzac Day, commemorating military service generally. In the Second World War, Australia faced its only direct attack on home soil when Japanese forces bombed Darwin in February 1942, and Australian troops fought a brutal defining campaign against Japanese forces along the Kokoda Track in Papua New Guinea later that year. The post war decades brought a deliberate large scale immigration program driven partly by a populate or perish security logic that dramatically diversified Australia's population, first from Britain and continental Europe, and after the White Australia policy's dismantling, increasingly from Asia and the Middle East. Politically, Aboriginal rights advanced through a series of major, hard fought milestones. The 1967 referendum, in which over 90% of Australians voted to amend the constitution to count Aboriginal people in the census and allow the federal government to legislate on their behalf. The 1992 Mabo decision, in which the High Court formally rejected the doctrine of terra nullius and recognized native title, Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander legal rights to land based on traditional connection. And most recently, the 2023 voice referendum. That referendum asked Australians to vote on amending the constitution to establish an Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander voice, an advisory body that could make representations to Parliament and government on matters affecting Indigenous Australians. The proposal grew out of the 2017 Uluru Statement from the Heart, a consensus document from a gathering of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander delegates. The Yes campaign argued the voice would improve outcomes for Indigenous communities by ensuring their perspectives were formally heard in policymaking. The No campaign argued from different directions that it risked creating constitutional and legal uncertainty. or that it would enshrine a distinction between citizens that ran counter to the principle of equality, or for some indigenous no campaigners, that it didn't go far enough toward genuine self determination. The referendum was defeated in October 2023, with over 60% of voters and a majority of states voting no. Reactions among Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Australians afterward varied considerably, from grief and a sense of rejection to relief among Indigenous no voters, to renewed calls for other forms of progress on treaty making and truth telling processes that some state governments continue to pursue. The broader question of reconciliation between modern Australia and its First Peoples remains, by most accounts, unresolved and actively debated. Australia's population sits at roughly 28 million people, concentrated overwhelmingly in a handful of coastal cities. Sydney and Melbourne each hold around 5 million people, followed by Brisbane, Perth, and Adelaide. Canberra, a planned city built specifically to serve as a neutral capital between rivals Sydney and Melbourne, holds the seat of federal government, currently led by Prime Minister Anthony Albanese. Formally, Australia remains a constitutional monarchy within the Commonwealth, with King Charles III as head of the state, represented domestically by a Governor General. This is one of the most multicultural nations on earth by composition. Roughly 3 in 10 residents were born overseas, and English, Chinese, Indian, Vietnamese, and Filipino ancestries all have substantial established communities alongside the historically dominant British and Irish base. Religiously, Australia has shifted markedly in recent decades. Recent census data shows people reporting no religious affiliation now make up the largest single category, ahead of any individual Christian denomination, though Christianity collectively remains the largest religious grouping. Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Australians today number over 900,000 people, around 3% of the population, and continue to experience significant, well documented disparities in health, life expectancy, and incarceration rates compared to the non Indigenous population. Government closing the gap targets, tracking measures like life expectancy and education outcomes have shown mixed and generally slower than hoped progress since the framework was established in 2008. Economically, Australia is a high volume, advanced economy, and by global standards, a genuinely comfortable place to live. Strong social safety net, universal public health care through Medicare, and a compulsory retirement savings system called superannuation that's made Australia's pension fund one of the largest in the world relative to its population. That said, housing affordability has become one of the country's most pressing domestic economic issues. Property prices and rents in major cities have risen sharply over the past 2 decades, and 2026 data continues to show tight rental vacancy rates and a persistent gap between housing supply and demand in Sydney and Melbourne in particular. A challenge the federal government has responded to with funding programs like the Housing Australia Future Fund. Education levels are high, with several Australian universities regularly ranking in global top 100 lists. And English is the dominant language in practice, though Australia has no official language at the federal level. Howard Florey, a pharmacologist from Adelaide, led the team that turned penicillin from a laboratory curiosity into a mass producible drug during the Second World War, arguably one of the single most life saving contributions to medicine in the 20th century, for which he shared the 1945 Nobel Prize with Alexander Fleming and Ernst Chain. Don Bradman remains by a genuinely absurd margin, the greatest batsman cricket has ever produced. His career Test batting average of 99.94 is so far ahead of the next best player in history that it's regularly cited in statistics classes as one of the most extreme outliers in the record of any major sport anywhere. Cathy Freeman, a Kuku Yalanji and Biri Guba woman, won gold in the 400 meters at the 2000 Sydney Olympics, becoming the first Aboriginal Australian to win an individual Olympic gold medal, and lit the Olympic cauldron at the opening ceremony of those same games. A moment widely described at the same time as a powerful, if complicated, symbol of a country working through its relationship with its First Peoples. Eddie Mabo, a Torres Strait Islander from the island of Mer, spent a decade pursuing a legal case that culminated in the 1992 High Court decision bearing his name, formally overturning terra nullius and establishing native title in Australian law, a legal transformation whose effects are still working through the courts today. Mabo died just months before the judgment was handed down. Kate Blanchett, born in Melbourne, has become one of the most decorated actors of her generation, with two Academy Awards and a career spanning theatre, art house cinema, and major franchise films. Part of a broader wave of Australian screen talent, alongside names like Nicole Kidman and Hugh Jackman, that's given the country outsized influence in global film and television relative to its population. And Fred Hollows, an ophthalmologist, spent much of his career restoring sight through cataract surgery in remote Aboriginal communities and later across the developing world. The foundation established in his name continues that work internationally today. Australian food is genuinely layered, an Aboriginal food tradition going back tens of thousands of years, a British colonial base, and more recently, one of the more adventurous, migration driven food cultures anywhere, with Asian, Mediterranean, and Middle Eastern influences fully mainstream rather than niche. Start with the classics. The meat pie, a handheld pastry filled with minced beef and gravy, is close to a national institution, sold everywhere from bakeries to sporting stadiums and traditionally topped with tomato sauce. Vegemite, a thick, intensely salty, umami rich spread made from leftover brewer's yeast extract, is spread thin on buttered toast and is one of those foods Australians grow up loving and which famously baffles most first time visitors. A proper Sunday roast, lamb in particular, remains a common family tradition with British roots. And the backyard barbecue, loaded with sausages, snags, and increasingly seafood, functions as a genuine social institution rather than just a cooking method. For dessert, the pavlova, a meringue base piled with cream and fresh fruit, is a fixture at celebrations. Though which country actually invented it is a long running, good natured dispute between Australia and New Zealand that neither side has ever really let go of. The Lamington, a sponge cake, square dipped in chocolate and rolled in coconut, is sometimes called the national cake. And native ingredients that predate colonialization by tens of thousands of years, witchetty grubs, bush tomato, Watlesd, quandong, and the macadamia nut, which is actually native to Australia's east coast rainforests, are increasingly showing up in contemporary Australian fine dining as chefs look to Aboriginal food knowledge rather than around it. Coffee culture deserves its own mention. Melbourne, in particular, has one of the most serious espresso cultures outside Italy. And the flat white, a strong espresso drink with microfoamed milk, is generally credited to Australia and New Zealand, though, much like the pavlova, exactly which side of the Tasman Sea gets to claim it is still argued about. Sydney is the obvious starting point. The Opera House and the Harbour Bridge dominate the skyline. Bondi Beach anchors the city's outdoor culture, and the harbour itself is genuinely one of the great natural city settings anywhere in the world. Melbourne, the cultural rival two states south, trades postcards, landmarks for laneway cafes, street art, and a fiercely loyal sports culture built around the Melbourne cricket ground. Uluru Juta National Park, in the heart of the continent, centers on the enormous sandstone monolith of Uluru, sacred to the local Anangu traditional people. In 2019, following decades of requests from Anangu traditional owners, the site's managing board permanently banned recreational climbing of the rock itself, and visitors are now encouraged toward guided walks around its base led by Anangu guides instead. The Great Barrier Reef off the Queensland coast remains one of the most extraordinary snorkeling and diving destinations on Earth, even as it faces real ongoing environmental pressure. Kakadu National Park, in the tropical top end, combines dramatic wetland and escarpment scenery with some of the oldest and most significant Aboriginal rock art galleries in the world. Some sites documenting tens of thousands of years of continuous artistic tradition. And Tasmania, the island state south of the mainland, offers a completely different Australia, cooler, greener, wilder, anchored by Hobart's Mona, the Museum of Old and New Art, one of the more provocative and talked about museums in the southern hemisphere. The currency is the Australian dollar, trading as of mid 2026 at roughly 1.43 to 1.45 to the US dollar. As always, worth checking a live rate before travel since it moves with global commodity prices. Australia's economy is advanced and resource heavy. Mining and energy, especially iron ore, liquefied natural gas, coal, and gold, account for roughly two-thirds of total merchandise exports, with the vast majority of iron ore shipped to steelmakers in China. Beyond resources, Australia has a large, sophisticated services sector, a globally significant higher education export industry built on international student enrollment, and a strong agricultural base in wheat, wool, and wine. Day to day costs run high by global standards. Australia consistently ranks among the more expensive countries for housing, groceries, and general living costs. And the Reserve Bank of Australia has kept interest rates elevated through the mid 2020s, partly in response to that inflationary pressure. It's a genuinely wealthy, high wage economy, but one where a large share of that wage increasingly goes toward rent or a mortgage. Ask most people outside Australia what comes to mind, and you'll hear some combination of kangaroos, koalas, the Sydney Opera House, the Great Barrier Reef, and a general laid back, sun drenched, dangerous wildlife stereotype that owes a lot to decades of tourism, marketing, and figures like the late Steve Irwin. What gets less global attention, Australia is the only country that is also a full continent. It's home to Aboriginal culture, the oldest continuous living culture documented anywhere on the planet, and it's produced an outsized share of globally significant medical research, from penicillin's mass production to major contributions in vaccine science and IVF technology. Aboriginal music traditions run deepest in music and arts. The didgeridoo, a long wooden wind instrument traditionally from Arnhem Land, produces a distinctive continuous drone through circular breathing and remains central to ceremony. alongside clapsticks and song traditions passed down through specific family and clan lines for tens of thousands of years. On the contemporary side, Australia has punched well above its population weight in rock and pop. AC/DC, INXS, and Kylie Minogue all built genuinely global followings. And Nick Cave, who spent decades blending post punk, gothic balladry, and literary songwriting with his band, The Bad Seeds, picked up his first Academy Award nomination in early 2026 for an original song written for the film Train Dreams. Visual arts took a genuinely distinctive turn from the 1970s onward with the Western Desert Art movement, in which Aboriginal artists in communities like Papunya began translating traditional ceremonial designs, dot painting in particular, onto canvas for the first time, creating a body of contemporary indigenous art now held in major museums worldwide. The Sydney Opera House itself, designed by Danish architect Jon Utzon and completed in 1973 after a famously difficult construction process, is a UNESCO World Heritage Site and remains one of the most recognizable buildings on Earth. In literature, Patrick White won the Nobel Prize in Literature in 1973, still the only Australian to do so. And Peter Carey has won twice the Booker Prize. And in film, beyond the wave of internationally successful actors, Australia has produced globally influential genre cinema too. From the original Mad Max films to horror breakout The Badabook, alongside a robust industry building major international productions on Australian sound stages. Australia has no official national sport and honestly doesn't need one. Cricket functions as the closest thing to a unifying national game, especially each summer when the Boxing Day test at the Melbourne Cricket Ground, MCG, draws enormous crowds, and the historic rivalry with England, known as the Ashes, still carries real weight. Beyond cricket, sporting loyalty splits by geography. Australian rules football, a fast, free flowing, and genuinely unique code played on huge oval grounds, dominates Victoria, Southern Australia, Western Australia, and Tasmania, while Rugby League holds similar cultural weight in New South Wales and Queensland, with the annual State of Origin series between the two states a legitimate national television event. Australia is also a swimming powerhouse, with a run of Olympic champions stretching from Dawn Fraser in the 1950s and 60s through to Ian Thorpe in the 2000s. And the country has hosted the Summer Olympics twice in Melbourne in 1956 and Sydney in 2000. Surfing is less an organized sport than a genuine lifestyle among much of the coastline. And netball, particularly among women and girls, has one of the highest participation rates of any sport in the country. Given a population of under 30 million, Australia's consistent top 10 finishes in Olympic medal tables is a routinely cited point of national pride, generally credited to heavy public investment in sports institutes and development pathways. The global image of Australia, kangaroos, crikey, deadly spiders, endless beaches, is broadly accurate as far as it goes. But it flattens a country that actually is one of the most urbanized on Earth. Most visitors arrive expecting rugged outback and spend their entire trip in cafes and on beaches within a few kilometers of a major city, because that's genuinely where almost everyone lives. What often surprises first time visitors is just how multicultural day to day Australian life actually is, particularly in Sydney and Melbourne, and how central Asian, Mediterranean, and Middle Eastern food and culture have become to the national mainstream rather than sitting apart from it. What Australia does well and gets relatively little global credit for: a genuinely strong public healthcare system, a higher education sector that draws students from across the world, and a level of workplace and lifestyle balance that consistently ranks the country near the top of global livable indices. The area Australia continues to actively work through, unresolved and openly debated within the country itself, is its relationship with Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Australians. The 2023 voice referendum settled one specific proposal, but the underlying questions about recognition, land, and inequality that produced it remain very much live. So that's Australia, a single country that's also a continent, home to both the oldest continuous culture on the planet and one of its youngest federations, with a national identity still actively working out how those two timelines fit together. From the Great Barrier Reef to the Red Centre to a sporting culture that treats a Tuesday night football match like a civic event. This is a place defined as much by scale and isolation as by any one image people carry of it. Next time, we head to Austria. From the vast, dry expanse of the world's biggest island to a small, landlocked country built around mountains, coffee houses, and a very different kind of empire. Thanks for listening to Around the World in Half an Hour. If you've enjoyed this, follow the show and leave a review. It genuinely helps people find this. Until next Monday.